In this Copilot Unplugged video, I want to share some thoughts about the linguistic schema, what it is, why you would make one, and the tooling we have available, as well as what that costs you in terms of time and effort. So first of all, what is a linguistic schema? A linguistic schema is basically looking at all the stuff we have in our semantic model. So fields, including tables, we have columns, we have measures, we have relationships between our tables. All of these things, these objects in our semantic model, these technical objects, we need words to be able to describe them if we want to ask questions of our data model, for example, using natural language. So we need some kind of tool, some kind of schema to map the words that we're going to use to the stuff that's in our model. So that's basically what the linguistic schema does. That's what it is it is effectively providing a structure to map language and terminology and concepts, basically, onto the semantic entities that we have in our model. Stuff like columns, stuff like measures. A very concrete example, I have a table called customers, but someone might refer to that as accounts. And I need a linguistic schema to be able to use a synonym to say that customers is equivalent to accounts. Now, that is what a linguistic schema is, so why would you need one? Like I said, you need one when you're going to interact and engage with your model using natural language. So this was already true using the Q&A experience, which is why if you want to work with a linguistic model, you have to go in modeling, and then you have to select this Q&A setup. So Q&A was a feature that already has existed for a while that allows you to interact with and engage with your model in natural language. But now, of course, we have Copilot, right? Like we can ask questions of our data model using the Copilot pane, for instance. If we set up a linguistic schema and we set up an accurate and representative example of how words and terms and concepts map onto our model, then Copilot should return more useful outputs. So the problem comes with the fact that a linguistic model is actually a lot more complicated and time-intensive to set up than most people realize. So you might read in documentation and hear in presentations, oh, you should set up synonyms, you should set up relationships. If you're developing semantic models, you might think, okay, that's not that big of a deal, like customers, accounts, all right? But think about it, you have to do this for every field and table in your model. That's a lot of effort, and you have to make sure it's representative of these business concepts with business language. So it's not just what you think, but it's the terms that users in the real world in your organization are going to use to talk about and discuss these concepts. All right? So basically, in a nutshell, you need a linguistic schema in order to improve the outputs from Copilot. Now, how can you manage a linguistic schema? We basically have two different ways. Number one, we could export it and manage an external file, make some changes, and then import it back. For instance, I have exported the linguistic schema, and I have it open now in Visual Studio Code. So as we can see, it is a YAML file with a very specific structure that has, for instance, our brands, and we have a definition, and we have terms that are using to describe it. So these are like the synonyms, and they have various states, like whether it's suggested, whether it's approved, and where it comes from. For instance, it could come from a thesaurus, or it could come from a Copilot, for instance, something like this. But as you can see, if you're going to manage it in this way, this can get pretty unwieldy. But if you're using something like GitHub Copilot, maybe this is your preferred way of doing it. The problem is, I think, is just there's just so much. Like this is a friggin' massive file, right? Like this is huge. So like we're looking at well over 10,000 lines for our particular semantic model. Like this is about a medium-sized model, more or less. It's not very small, not very large, not very complicated, but it's still like a very, very massive file. So it's one option. What are the other options? We could also do it in Power BI Desktop. If we click this button here, Q&A Setup, then we can use a user interface to manage the linguistic schema. So here we can select synonyms. You can also do this here on the left-hand side, synonyms and relationships. these are the two things that are part of the linguistic schema. There's some other things here that are related to Q&A. I expect that because this is all about Q&A, I expect that there's probably going to come out with something, some tooling that's with Copilot, because right now it's not very clear that you should do this. There's no suggestions when I want to use, like say I'm a semantic model developer and I want to use Copilot. There is nothing in the tool telling me or suggesting to me that this stuff is related to Copilot, number one, and number two, that it's important for me to improve the outputs from Copilot. So I think that's problem number one. So I expect that that will change and we'll get some kind of like Copilot tooling. But let's take a look at the state of the tooling now. So even if you were to swap Q&A for Copilot, basically, when we're looking at synonyms, so this is the first thing we can look at, or we could look at relationships. What are synonyms? Like I said, synonyms are basically different words and terms that we use to describe this stuff in our model. Tables, columns, measures, all of that. So we have a list of all of our tables. They expand, and then we have columns, and we have measures, and all of that. We have the confirmed synonyms that are available here. We have suggested synonyms from Copilot with this sparkle icon. We have suggested synonyms from a thesaurus. And if I can find some, there's also suggested synonyms from our organization. So the ones from our organization have a little building icon. I don't see any immediately. I think there was some in the date table. So yeah, like this. This is suggested synonyms from our organization, for example. Okay, so what we could do is then we could go through, and we should go through and then approve some synonyms. We can add synonyms manually. So I gave the example of customers should be called accounts and so on. So I could add it. So let's say that customers might also be called like client, for instance. So that was one of the suggestions. But it's also generating other suggestions. So again, the source is coming from this thesaurus. We see that when we hover on it. But we also have this toggle here, include in Q&A. If we tick this off, it means that this is going to be excluded from our Copilot and Q&A. So like it says here, it's not going to affect the data pane, but we could get the same result by hiding the field. So most Copilot experiences ignore hidden fields, but the DAX query view experience will still consider it. I don't know if the DAX experience view will consider it if you turn it off here. I think it won't. So I think this is basically a way to shut down tables, columns, fields, measures from your model by clicking these indicators. So you could generate synonyms with Copilot if you have Copilot. You can go here in the suggestion settings if it opens. Okay, it doesn't want to open. All right, here we go. So we can choose where we want to get those synonyms from, whether we want to share approved synonyms, and whether we want Copilot to interpret unrecognized terms. If that is ticked on, then Copilot synonyms will be generated automatically. We don't have to push a button to get it. Okay, apply. Apply. Okay, this is a user interface that doesn't cooperate sometimes, but so what do I want to show here? What is the key message? Well, I'm explaining what you see, but basically you can imagine like we have all these tables here, and for each of these tables, we have all of these fields, columns, and measures, and we have to go through and look at every single one of these in order to make sure that we have synonyms that reflect how the people in our organization talk about this business process. Because if they're going to engage with our semantic model using natural language, then we want their natural language to be reflected in the linguistic schema. Now, you can see here that we don't have Copilot suggested synonyms for a lot of these fields. They are appearing for some of them, but definitely not all of them. And some of the suggestions that are coming from Copilot, or the thesaurus in this case, they're not necessarily going to be helpful. So if we look at, for instance, the brands table, so it's suggesting logo and signature, things like this. So here for the hierarchy, the brand structure, hierarchy level, that might make sense. Ranking, I don't know. So we have to go through and think about each one of these. And if the suggestions, we don't want to add or approve them, then we have to add them ourselves. And we have to make sure that we also remove any that have been automatically added that are not useful. So I saw a very good example of that, actually. So this is the other thing, you can't search it, right? I saw a good example in the margin, but I don't even remember where I saw that. So I think here, delivery margin, so the synonym is also margin. So we actually want to remove that because there are 3 different margins. So we want the users to be specific and to say what margin they want, for instance. So you can imagine if you have a reasonably sized model, like a medium to large model, it depends on what your definition of model size. But this is something that's pretty representative of what I see in most organizations. If anything, it's pretty small. This is going to take a lot of time. This is not something that's going to take you a couple hours or even a couple days. It could take a lot longer because you're going to have to scroll through each one of these things and you're going to have to remember where you left off. If you add new fields or remove fields, you're going to have to go back in here and manage it again, and you can't search for those fields. So this is pretty unwieldy, and I don't think that the tooling is necessarily appropriate given how important this is for Copilot to get a result, So that's synonyms, and I'll say a little bit more about it in a moment, but let's talk about relationships. Now, relationships are a lot more complicated and nuanced because synonyms are easy to understand. It's pretty one-to-one. So customer, account, brand, maybe you also call it like logo or mark or whatever, like Copilot was suggesting. But relationships are very different because we're referring to different relationship types, verbs, prepositions, names. Some of the things we see off here, like brands spin off sub-brands. Brands are names/IDs of brands. Materials are in product names. So it's showing hierarchical structure. It's showing, how things relate to other things. That's what we mean by relationships. So relationships here, don't get it confused with the concept of relationships between tables. I actually think that they might want to use different words here, like associations. So see it more as associations. Associations between linguistic concepts and words and terminology in natural language and what you have in your model. So this is actually quite interesting because you're really having to flex your brain muscles and think about, how would I describe the business process as it's reflected semantically in my data model? And those are muscles you're probably not used to using if you're a semantic model developer. Maybe during like the requirements gathering phase or something like this, but it's not something that's very typical that you think about, like brands spin off sub-brands. It's logical when you think about the actual business process, but it's a different kind of thinking. And this is really hard if you're not a native English speaker. So what kinds of tools does Power BI give you? Well, it also provides these Copilot suggestions. For example, we have here like total orders indicate how abundant orders are. Net orders indicates how abundant orders are. So that's something we might want to approve. So then it goes into the approved relationships. But we see that Copilot has suggested a lot of these relationships. And a lot of these suggestions are also kind of redundant, like forecast determine products, and it happens 3 different times. Dates determine products. Products require dates. So some of these things make no sense, actually. So if I'm honest, I think this is very limited in terms of how useful it is. It's only useful for you to start to think about what kinds of things you could put in your relationships. Because again, this isn't a muscle that you're typically using. So this could be useful for like an iterative exercise, but most of the things you're going to see here, like forecast shape products, probably it's going to be totally useless. And it's just going to be helpful to kind of jog your mind and get you thinking about it. So synonyms and relationships, this linguistic schema, it's important for Copilot for working in natural language with your model. But the challenge here is that you can spend multiple days, even like, let's say you spend like a week and a half on this, trying to get your semantic model as complete as possible. You would have to, first of all, make sure that you work with people from the business to make sure that this reflects the language that they use, and that you're not missing something. So this is really going to have to be like a human-driven process. The helpfulness of AI in this context, in my opinion, is very limited. And the other thing is that after a week and a half, you could do this, and you'll probably see better outputs from Copilot, like probably. And it's pretty easy to anticipate when you do something like you add a synonym for customers as accounts, and then you see someone use the word accounts in their prompt. It's pretty easy to see the association there between what you did, the action you took as a developer, and the resulting output that Copilot provided. But I would say, like the majority of the time, there is no clear relationship or association between the actions you take in this linguistic modeling and the output that you'll see. If I'm going to, for example, approve this relationship, flagships are in classes, and I'm going to add more relationships like this, it is very hard for me to anticipate the meaningful impact that that's going to have on a user's experience and the usefulness of the Copilot outputs. That is true not only because it's just vague in general, like we're talking about linguistics as it relates to our data model, but also because this is a non-deterministic technology. And it's changing week to week. So to give a very concrete example, one of the things I struggle with when I'm working with Copilot is sometimes I'll ask a question, like give me turnover for August 2021, and then it gives me the turnover, or tries to give me the turnover for August 2024 and 2021. I have no idea why it's trying to refer to 2024. I have no idea what I would add in the model, in the linguistic modeling, that could or should impact that. If I spend time on the linguistic relationships, particularly with dates, could that help? Maybe, probably, but there's no way for me to know for sure. So the vagueness between, again, developer actions and Copilot output is something that makes this very challenging, especially because it's such a time and effort intensive task. So this isn't something that you can just hand wave off to AI, because if you do that, let's say you just run like the YAML file through GPT or whatever, and you get a bunch of synonyms back, you saved so much time, you're so happy. But in the reality, those synonyms are completely divorced from the actual language that people are using in the business. You could even make Copilot worse in that context. You could make the outputs worse. So an example is the one that I had showed you with, if we go back to the delivery margin, like there was a synonym for delivery margin as just margin, but that's not reflective of the reality. When someone says margin, usually they're talking about the standard margin, but there's 3 different margins, so we want to avoid the ambiguity. So to summarize everything I'm saying here, a linguistic schema is important when you're using natural language to work with your model. It's important when you're using Copilot. It should help produce more useful outputs. But the maturity of this tooling and the level of guidance that's available is just too low to be able to get value out of this in a really predictably meaningful way. And I think the best guidance I can give you, if you really want to create a good linguistic schema, is to just go through the synonyms yourself with people from the business and the relationships. And when you have invested enough time in it that you look through it and you feel like it meaningfully reflects the business process that you're reporting on, then yeah, your linguistic schema is probably going to help, and you'll probably get better outputs from Copilot. But again, you will never know for sure how, the actions you took in that linguistic schema development, how much that's affecting the quality of those outputs. So that's all I have to say. Don't underestimate the amount of time, effort, and energy that this takes, and the relative complexity. In the future, I hope that there's more mature tooling that's going to become available, and also more concrete and clear guidance so that developers know what to do, particularly because this is so new. Otherwise, I think if we just continue telling people add synonyms, add relationships, it's just going to be useless advice. And probably 99% of models are not going to have a very useful linguistic schema. So that's just my point of view. That's all I have to say. See you next time.